Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking on a massive task. We want to build the essential historical and, the cultural context you absolutely need to understand King David.
hmm
He's maybe the most celebrated monarch in all of ancient Israelite history, but we're going to be looking specifically at the very controversial subject of his polygamy.
And that's the key. We're not here to just read dogma or accept the story as it's often told.
No.
We're here to read the source material critically.
Exact.
And that's the core mission for today. You really can't just jump into the narrative of David's multiple wives without first understanding the, frankly, unstable governmental structure he was inheriting.
It's all about the foundation.
It is. So think of this as part one. We are laying that foundational stage. Our focus today is entirely on the volatile, almost chaotic history of leadership in ancient Israel. We're talking about the failure of the judges,
A massive failure.
a massive failure, and then the desperate political demand that rose up for a monarchy and the cultural stage that allowed this one charismatic war hero to gain unprecedented, unchecked power.
And we've stacked up the sources for this. We've done a really thorough exploration of these biblical structures. And our goal for you is to deliver a really well-informed, comprehensive analysis that puts critical thinking first.
We have to. We're making sure we don't skip over the uncomfortable details.
Yoga.
Because the context of David's rise to power
Yeah.
is messy, it's violent, and it's utterly compelling.
So let's start with, I guess, the meta challenge of this whole project, which is just reading the Old Testament itself.
Right.
For so many people, and it doesn't matter if you're coming from a secular background or a faith background, it is a demanding text.
It's incredibly demanding. It's dense, it's complex, and honestly, just trying to read it cover to cover can feel overwhelming.
It really can. It sort of demands a level of historical and cultural fluency that is just difficult for anyone to maintain.
It absolutely is. And that is precisely why we have to start by, critiquing the overly simplified, dogmatic ways of interpreting the Bible that are so common.
The black and white approach.
Exactly. If you go into the Old Testament demanding a simple black and white moral code, you are guaranteed to just run into walls over and over again.
Because it's not there.
It's not. The source material for this deep dive repeatedly emphasizes that the text itself often contradicts itself. It creates this complexity that just demands a tremendous amount of intellectual humility from the reader.
That concept of humility, that's key, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
almost like the sheer weight of all these contradictions it's designed to stop us from feeling totally certain about any single interpretation.
I think so, precisely. If you are reading the Old Testament with a truly open mind, it should, ideally, lead you to this realization that almost every rule and certainty you might try to pull from the text is undermined or contradicted somewhere else.
It's a very human document in that way.
It is. It's a text of, human experience and legal codes, poetry, war stories, all of it just mashed together over centuries. Acknowledging the complexity helps us move past these rigid, singular interpretations and lets us view the people and the cultures we're studying with a much greater degree of nuance.
Okay, so with that complex frame of mindset, let's pivot to the figure who stands right at the center of this whole story, David. The common image of David is, he's the ultimate hero.
And that image is absolutely earned through these legendary exploits, right? We hear the stories from his youth. He wasn't just a shepherd. He was this highly capable protector of his flock. He's noted for slaying both a lion and a bear.
Which is incredible.
It is. And these tales, they establish his strength and, this idea of divine favor long before he ever steps onto the national stage.
And then, of course, you have the pivotal moment, the defining moment that just catapults him into national fame, slaying Goliath. He brings down the Philistine giant, and in doing so, he saves Israel from bondage, from slaughter. He's an instant celebrity.
That event cemented his popularity. It set him on the path to kingship. But, the path wasn't a straight line. We also see this long period where he was already anointed by the prophet Samuel, but he spent years literally running for his life from the sitting king, Saul.
Right. Saul saw him as this huge existential threat.
He did. So David becomes this successful fugitive, essentially. He's leading his own private army. Our sources call it his band of merry men.
It's like a Robin Hood story.
It has that feel, doesn't it? He's this renegade with hundreds of followers, moving around, living completely outside of Saul's control. It's the ultimate underdog narrative, where the hero is living outside the established law, but he's gathering immense popular support until finally he establishes his own unified rule.
And that brings us to that famous phrase that's used to describe him, often cited by the Apostle Paul much later in the New Testament: a man after God's own heart.
That quote, which comes from the book of Acts, has really framed David's legacy for millennia.
But if we're meant to read the Old Testament critically, as we've said, that phrase immediately creates a kind of dissonance. What does a man after God's own heart truly mean when you contrast it with what King David does later?
That is the crucial, uncomfortable question we absolutely have to face. If that description is literal, that David somehow flawlessly represented the divine, then we are forced to justify parts of his life that are, according to our sources, hugely troubling.
And that's putting it mildly.
It is. Once David gets power, we see bloodthirstiness, we see warmongering, political maneuvering, and later severe moral failures in his family and his personal life. He just doesn't fit the mold of a standard moral exemplar. The source text itself contains all the evidence of this internal struggle.
So, if we step back from a strictly literal, sort of spiritual interpretation, how should we understand the overwhelming praise and fame, the idolization David received? Our sources draw a really compelling analogy here.
They do. They draw a parallel to how we today treat modern sports celebrities.
Now, that's interesting.
Think about it. David was noted for his physical beauty, his charisma, his incredible talent, his wealth, his fame. Now think of figures we hold up today. You know, the Tom Bradys, the Michael Jordans, the Cristiano Ronaldos. These are people whose talent and success cause us to elevate them far beyond just simple admiration.
And David wasn't just a sports hero, he was a war hero.
Exactly.
In ancient Israel, success on the battlefield was literally the difference between survival and annihilation. He led the national team to a definitive victory. He was young, charismatic, talented, and utterly victorious, the ultimate gifted individual.
And this elevates him to what our sources call a Greek god status.
Right.
When you look at the original Greek Olympics, the heroes were seen as almost divine figures. So the overwhelming praise for David, therefore, can be interpreted not as a description of his deep, flawless spirituality, but as a recognition of his, his demeanor, his talent, his abundance. They were treating him practically as a god, or at least a Greek god type. He just seemed untouched by typical human failure until his power became absolute.
And this leads us right to the critical warning that the sources highlight: the danger of placing human beings, even biblical figures, on a pedestal.
Exactly right. When you treat a hero like David as semi-divine, you open the door to justifying anything he does.
The logic becomes flawed.
It becomes a logical fallacy. It goes, David was after God's own heart. David did X. Therefore, X must be universally sanctioned and good to do. This becomes extremely problematic when you're analyzing polygamy or his bloodthirstiness or any of his later moral failures. We have to resist placing flawed humans, however charismatic or successful they are, on a pedestal, because it just leads to justifying their troubling actions as universally good, even if those actions are merely the result of a charismatic hero with completely unchecked power.
Okay, so if we accept that David was this charismatic man who was elevated to a position of unchecked power, the next question is really central to our whole deep dive. Where did his polygamy come from? Was it something he inherited? Was it a family tradition passed down from his father, Jesse? Or was it a behavior he learned and acquired purely through his political position?
And our sources argue pretty forcefully that it was the latter. It was a function of political and economic power, not family tradition.
So where do we start with that?
Well, we can start by establishing the principle that plural marriage appears to be far more the exception than the rule in the Old Testament narrative as a whole.
And the evidence for that is actually in the structure of the text itself, isn't it?
Precisely. The Bible explicitly tells the reader when a man has more than one wife. If the text has to make a specific note of it, saying, for example, that Elkanah, who is Samuel's father, had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah, that suggests that the standard assumption, the default, should be monogamy.
So when the text is silent, we shouldn't just assume polygamy without some other evidence.
Exactly. We should assume the default, which seems to be monogamy.
Okay, so when we trace David's immediate family line back, what do we find? Is there a family precedent for this?
We find a distinct lack of it. That's what's so telling. To find the first clear polygamist in David's ancestry, you have to go back an enormous 11 generations to Jacob.
11 generations, wow.
That is a massive chronological gap, and it indicates that polygamy was not a recent or a persistent feature in his immediate family culture. His father, Jesse, appears to have had only one wife. His grandfather, Ubed, likewise. If it were some continuing family tradition, you would expect to see it mentioned much closer to David's generation.
Now, we have to pause here because there's a specific historical claim that often gets brought up to justify polygamy as a scriptural norm, and that's the case of Boaz and Ruth.
Right, and our source material is completely unequivocal here. There is, and I'm quoting, zero evidence for the claim that Boaz was a polygamist when he married Ruth, or even that he'd been married before.
So all the evidence points the other way.
In fact, much of the narrative implies the opposite, that he was unmarried until he met and married Ruth, which would make him a monogamist. To read the text critically, you need some evidence before assuming polygamy, and in this frequently cited case, the evidence just doesn't exist.
So if the family line isn't the origin, what other contextual evidence do we have that suggests David's family was monogamous?
Our sources bring up a massive factor, the economic barrier,
Yes.
specifically the cultural requirement of the bride price.
This point is absolutely critical to understanding the society. We see the economic reality of marriage just laid bare in that bizarre interaction between King Saul and David.
That's a very strange story.
It is. Saul is plotting against David, and he hints through his servants that David can marry the king's daughter. And David's immediate response, which you can find in 1 Samuel, is that he's too poor. He says he's not well-renowned, and he couldn't possibly afford the necessary dowry, or, to be more accurate here, the bride price.
And in this specific royal case, the bride price was incredibly strange. It was 100 Philistine foreskins, which was basically Saul's way of trying to get David killed in battle.
Right. But if you strip away the gore, the fundamental culture is still there. Marriage required a significant payment from the groom's family.
It absolutely did. And we need to be clear about the terminology for you, the listener. A dowry is typically the wealth a wife brings into the marriage. But in this specific patriarchal culture, marriage required a bride price. This is a payment made by the husband's family to the bride's father.
It's essentially to acquire the daughter.
Yes, and the practice is inherently misogynistic. It treats women as possessions to be bought.
And this practice had very real, very severe societal consequences that directly impact how we understand David's family background, right?
Yes, absolutely. The practice of a bride price causes massive societal strain. It can force families into debt. And in some cultures, the economic necessity of pooling resources means that sons might even have to share wives because the family simply cannot afford multiple bride prices.
So the key takeaway here is economic.
It's entirely economic. Since David himself claimed poverty, which suggests his father Jesse was also not a wealthy man, Jesse would have lacked the means to afford the significant bride prices necessary to take and then to keep multiple wives.
So that circumstantial evidence, the lack of money, combined with the lack of any scriptural mention, it strongly suggests that David did not inherit polygamy.
No.
He acquired it as a privilege of kingship.
It certainly makes the case for it being a political acquisition very robust.
Yeah.
However, before we move completely into the political context, we have to deal with the one other major polygamist example in David's genealogy.
Jacob's son, Judah.
Yes, Judah and the very difficult story of Tamar.
This is one of those Old Testament narratives that is, it's just difficult to process. Tamar marries Judah's son, but he dies childless.
And under the law of Moses, it's a form of what's called levirate marriage. The next brother was obligated to marry her to provide an heir for the deceased brother.
But Judah holds back his youngest son. He doesn't keep his promise, so Tamar takes matters into her own hands. She disguises herself.
She disguises herself as a prostitute, knowing Judah would be traveling along a certain road. He sleeps with her, not knowing who she is, and she conceives a child. And this story is absolutely central to the genealogy of Jesus because David descended directly from this line.
And this leads us to the critical point about justification that the sources really require us to address.
Absolutely. If someone tries to argue that being included in the genealogy of David, and later Jesus, somehow justifies polygamy because Jacob was in that line, or that having multiple partners was okay because Judah participated in this transaction,
then you run into a problem.
you run into a huge problem. Because you must also then acknowledge that prostitution is explicitly present in the very same family line through that story of Tamar and Judah.
You can't just pick and choose which ancestral actions are justified and which ones aren't.
You can't. The presence of these events in the genealogy is a record of flawed human actions, of strategic choices, and sometimes just sheer desperation. It is not necessarily a divine endorsement of those actions.
So it weakens the argument.
It fundamentally weakens any argument that inclusion in this lineage automatically gives a two-thumbs-up sanction to polygamy or any other troubling behaviors. These biblical figures are presented as deeply flawed individuals who were part of a larger divine plan, not as infallible moral templates for us to copy.
Okay, so the stage is now set. David did not inherit polygamy from a family tradition.
No.
He acquired it through political status. And this means we have to do a deep examination of the government he replaced, the chaotic, the unstable system of the judges.
This system defined Israel for centuries. The estimates in the sources, they vary pretty widely. Some historians say 330 to 380 years, but the book of Acts cites a figure up to 450 years.
So a very long time.
A very long foundational period after Moses and Joshua brought the people into the Promised Land.
And what exactly was the role of a judge? It sounds like they were wearing far too many hats for just one person.
They really were. They were simultaneously a military leader, a political ruler, a prophet, and the final arbiter of conflict. They held all the authority, supposedly under the direct governance of God theocracy.
But there was a defining flaw.
A fatal flaw. The Achilles heel of the judgeship system was its instability, and that instability was centered primarily on succession.
Because there was no formal process for a transition of power.
Zero clarity. There were no elections, no appointments, and no hereditary rules, at least not at the beginning. The text simply says, God rose up a judge.
And that's it.
That's it. And this lack of clarity is the root of the entire problem. If authority is gained through a divine calling, how is that calling validated across a society of scattered, often competing tribes? How did the rest of Israel just agree that, yes, this person now has legitimacy?
That ambiguity must have created massive instability and probably infighting every single time a judge died.
It did, and it led to this recurring vicious pattern that's detailed throughout the entire book of Judges. The cycle. A judge is raised up, they call the people to repentance, and they deliver them from the slaughter and bondage being inflicted by their neighbors. Then the judge dies. The people quickly fall back into wickedness. They are again subjected to slaughter and bondage. And then the Lord raises up another judge. It just repeats incessantly.
It's a constant, brutal boom and bust cycle. It must have prevented any kind of long-term cultural or political development. And it raises a huge question for me. Were the people really just falling into wickedness, or were they simply being weakened by these constant succession crises?
It's highly probable that the internal strife, the power vacuum left by a dying judge, the uncertainty, the likely civil wars over who would step up next, that's what consistently weakened the people and left them vulnerable to external powers. The system itself guaranteed volatility.
And this volatility reached a terrifying peak towards the end of the book of Judges.
Oh, yes. The end of the era of Judges, after figures like Samson, is just characterized by utter escalating chaos. The narratives become truly shocking.
We move past just typical military conflicts into something much darker.
A profound societal breakdown. We get the story of Micah and the graven images and the false priests. That's followed by the entire tribe of Dan committing genocide and then stealing those priests to set up their own corrupted system of worship.
And then the story that signals a total moral collapse. The story of the concubine.
It's horrific. She is raped to death only for her husband to then butcher her body into 12 pieces and send them out to the tribes of Israel as a call to war.
Called a civil war.
Yes. That act immediately ignites a devastating civil war against the tribe of Benjamin. The resulting conflict was so severe that the tribe of Benjamin was almost entirely wiped out. Only 600 men survived by fleeing into the wilderness. This is anarchy resulting in national suicide.
And the attempt to correct the slaughter is almost as horrific as the crime that started it.
It is. To save the tribe from total extinction, the elders, who are operating under no clear legal authority at all, first they slaughter the inhabitants of a town called Jabesh Gilead to seize their young virgins as wives for the remaining 600 men.
And that's not even enough.
It's not. So later they plot to kidnap girls from the festival at Shiloh. This level of violence, genocide, and human trafficking demonstrates a complete collapse of law, of order, and of any shared morality.
And this entire chaotic, brutal period is framed by this constant lamentation that's woven throughout the book of Judges.
Yes. 4 separate times the text explicitly states, "In those days there was no king in Israel."
And the final verse?
The final verse, Judges 21.25, summarizes the entire disastrous era with the chilling conclusion. "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes."
And when you put that final sentence in its proper context, a context of genocide, rape, and civil war, it's not a celebration of freedom.
Not at all. It's a profound, desperate lament against anarchy. It is a plea for any kind of external order, almost at any cost.
So the system of judges proved unstable and violent in the extreme. But that instability, it didn't just stop there. The problems of succession and, maybe more importantly, corruption within the leadership continued right up to the very moment the monarchy was established.
Yes.
And we start with Eli, who was both the high priest and the judge. He served for a significant period of 40 years.
Eli's tenure really represents the ultimate failure of accountability within a system that was supposed to be purely divine. His catastrophic failure centered on blatant, unmitigated nepotism.
He abused his office.
He abused his office by ordaining and supporting his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, as priests, and he was fully aware of their extreme wickedness. This single act enabled years and years of systemic abuse.
And the wickedness wasn't subtle, was it? It fundamentally polluted the office of the priesthood and the very concept of worship in Israel.
It was an egregious breach of trust and law. They committed theft. They stole meat offerings from the people and from the Lord, demanding raw meat outside of the prescribed tradition, and even threatening violence if they didn't get it immediately.
But the worst of it was the abuse against the people themselves.
Yes. Our sources note that they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation.
And that's described in the sources as being akin to a spiritual wifery system. Can you elaborate on just how severe that violation was?
It represents using their sacred religious office to coerce, to pressure, or to manipulate women who came to the tabernacle for the purpose of worship. It's an abuse of spiritual authority for sexual gain. They were supposed to be mediators between God and the people, and instead, they were exploiting the most vulnerable individuals who came seeking solace or some kind of spiritual connection.
And Eli, the one person who could have stopped them, who had the authority of both the judge and the high priest, he did nothing substantial.
He merely gave them a feeble talking to. He delivered a verbal rebuke. But crucially, he did nothing to enforce the law, nothing to remove them, nothing to punish them. He sustained the abuse by keeping them in office for years. The people had no recourse.
So there's no institutional check on corruption.
None. And it meant the entire population had to just bear under that for quite a long time until something truly dramatic happened.
And the intervention, when it finally came, was divine, but even that failed to spur Eli to action.
That's right. God sent a man of God, a non-presiding officer, which is a signal that authority is being removed from the established line, to warn Eli. The message, recorded in 1 Samuel, was explicit. Eli had honored thy sons above me, and he'd scorned the sacred offerings. God decreed that Eli's house would fall.
And then the warning came again.
Yes. Later, the young prophet Samuel reaffirmed that curse, stating that Eli was being judged because his sons made themselves vile and he restrained them not.
Yet, despite these terrifying, explicit divine warnings, Eli just maintained the status quo. He kept his corrupt sons in their position.
They did. And the tragedy culminated on the day the curse was fulfilled. His sons took the sacred Ark of the Covenant into battle with them, and they were both killed. When the news arrived, Eli, who the text describes as very old and very heavy, blind and overweight, fell backward off his seat, broke his neck, and died.
And the tragedy just keeps compounding.
His daughter-in-law, hearing the news, also died in childbirth on the exact same day. The entire corrupt structure just collapsed in an instant, but only after decades of suffering, because there was no earthly accountability mechanism to prevent this kind of nepotism.
But the cycle of corruption, tragically, it didn't break there. The people who lived through Eli's failure then had to watch the next prophet and judge, Samuel, repeat the exact same pattern.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it? Samuel, the one who was supposed to represent this new, clean slate, he also ordained his own sons as judges. And they, too, proved to be corrupt. 1 Samuel 8.3 confirms that they walked not in his ways, but turned aside after filthy lucre and took bribes and perverted judgment.
So the people see this pattern. They see the instability and the violence of the judgeship. They endured decades of Eli's corrupt sons, and now they're watching Samuel sustain his own corrupt, bribe-taking sons.
This was the absolute breaking point. Seeing the instability, the fresh memory of Eli's disaster, and Samuel now perpetuating the pattern, the elders of Israel finally took action.
They demanded a king.
They demanded a king. They approached Samuel, and they said they needed a king to judge them like all the nations, because they were seeking a better, more stable system that they hoped would have some kind of check or remedy for this inherited corruption. They were just tired of suffering under unaccountable hereditary judges who operated without any scrutiny.
Samuel, however, was displeased. He viewed this political demand as a profound personal rejection of his leadership.
Yes, but when he prayed about it, God offered an interpretation that our sources really compel us to examine critically. God told Samuel that they had not rejected Samuel, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them.
And that interpretation it's difficult to reconcile with the facts on the ground, isn't it? How did the rule of bribe-taking, sexually abusive, and nepotistically installed sons of Eli and Samuel truly represent the rule of the Lord?
This is where the critical analysis has to focus. It seems far more likely, given the historical context of anarchy and corruption, that the elders were rejecting the corruption and the instability that had defined the system of judges. They weren't rejecting the Lord himself.
They were seeking functional governance.
They were seeking functional governance. In fact, their approach was actually quite humble. They acknowledged Samuel's authority, and they asked him to choose the king for them. They didn't attempt a violent coup to install their own leader. They were just seeking stability, and they believed a king offered that remedy.
But the trade-off they were making, trading that anarchy for a king, it was fraught with massive danger. And Samuel wasted no time in warning them about it.
He warned them explicitly about the tyranny of monarchy. Unlike the judgeship before Eli and Samuel, kingship was dynastic, it was hereditary, and it centralized all power. Samuel warned that the king would have nearly absolute, unchecked power, essentially owning everything and everyone in the kingdom.
He detailed the terrifying scope of this power grab.
He did. He said the king would take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and he would seize their best servants, their young men and their sheep, turning the entire population into his servants. This is the very definition of tyranny, of dictatorship, and the unchecked greed of centralized leadership. They would be replacing the instability of anarchy with the certainty of oppression.
And here's a fascinating detail that our sources highlight: the connection between the king's tyranny and that specific phrase, taking a tenth.
It's a remarkable parallel in the narrative. In this specific political warning, the act of taking a tenth, which often has, religious or ceremonial associations with tithing, is presented explicitly as a symbol of the king's tyranny and greed.
So it's a perversion of that idea.
It is. It signals how far the king would reach into the economic lives of the people to maintain his oppressive power structure. It shows that what the king takes is not a blessing from God, but an imposition that strips the people of their prosperity and their autonomy.
So in demanding a king to escape the corruption of the judges, the people were essentially trading one form of human corruption, anarchy, and self-dealing nepotism for another, the absolute unchecked power of a monarch. And that monarch, David, was about to step onto the stage. Okay. This historical analysis really leaves us with the profound central dilemma that ancient Israel was facing. They had to choose between the chaos of the judges, which led to anarchy and slaughter and local corruption, or the highly centralized dynastic rule of kings, which led to the potential for systemic, unchecked tyranny and oppression. Both systems, fundamentally, were fatally vulnerable to human corruption.
Indeed. It forces us to ask, if both of the primary governmental models presented in the Old Testament ultimately failed, the judges because of instability and nepotism, and the kings because of the dangers of absolute power, what are we, the modern reader, supposed to learn from these chronic failures?
Well, the source offers a really compelling theory about this, and it has to do with the U.S. Constitution's framers. These individuals relied heavily on biblical ideas and history as they were conceiving a new governmental structure. So they must have been acutely aware of these historical failures that are described so vividly in the Old Testament.
The hypothesis is that the framers approached these biblical narratives not as prescriptive blueprints to be copied, but critically.
As cautionary tales.
Exactly, as cautionary tales. They saw the utter anarchy of the judges' system, which ended in mass violence, and they saw the inherent dangers detailed in Samuel's warning about kingship, the dangers of centralized absolute authority.
So they used those negative historical outcomes as instructional failures to try and build a better system.
That is the compelling theory. They recognized the inherent destructive potential for corruption in every single form of human leadership. And therefore, they designed a system that was focused on checks and balances. They intentionally encouraged conflicting interests, legislative, executive, judicial, to counteract and counterbalance authority.
To prevent that kind of unchecked power.
To prevent the kind of unchecked, hereditary power that led to the abuses under both the kings and the nepotistic judges.
This critical reading of scripture and history, then, that feels like the ultimate takeaway for us as listeners today.
Absolutely. We cannot put the Old Testament systems of government, whether it's the judges or the kings, on a pedestal because the framers of the Constitution essentially rejected those models by approaching them with a critical, outcome-based perspective. They looked at the fruits of those systems and said, we must build a remedy against that outcome.
And this empowers us then to approach scripture and religious traditions and our own political structures with that same necessary courage and intellectual integrity.
I think so.
We should be examining the tangible outcomes, like the development of polygamy or the corruption of priests or the oppression of kings, to find better ways forward rather than just passively justifying everything purely based on historical precedent.
It shifts the focus from simple acceptance to critical application. And it allows us to view these complex texts as profound lessons about human nature and the inherent dangers of power, compelling us to always look at the final fruits of any given system.
So we have established a comprehensive and I think a very necessary foundation today.
Right.
We've detailed David's rise to this Greek god status and the economic proof that his polygamy was not a family tradition, but a political acquisition.
Mhm.
And crucially, we explored the utter anarchy and instability caused by the failed system of judges and the pervasive corruption under figures like Eli and Samuel.
We've established that the demand for monarchy, while it was a solution to anarchy, immediately ushered in a new system that was defined by the danger of unchecked power, complete with Samuel's explicit warning about absolute tyranny. The stage is completely set.
And now, David, this highly charismatic hero who has already achieved this idolized status, is stepping into a government structure that is designed for absolute, unchecked authority. The burning question for our next deep dive is how that authority, political and personal, manifested in his life.
That is where we turn next. We will move specifically into the actual marriages, the acquisition of David's wives, and the subsequent narrative of King David to see precisely how that unchecked authority was used or abused in his personal life.
Until then, keep digging, keep questioning, and above all, keep reading critically.